They completely shut down their building. We had no access to it. In fact, it was hard to even get in there and get our stuff for a while. So we kind of relaunched again. I always say that we've started over at Crosswalk Chattanooga 3 times. The first time was the launch. Second time was during COVID. And so figuring out another venue, figuring out how to do in-person services, how to do pop-ups. We didn't feel equipped on paper that we should be buying this church. It didn't make sense.
Yeah.
It did not make sense. You realize that this is happening. I'm like, no, I don't know. And she looked at this, Joyce Newmeyer. She looked at me and she said, Brooks, this is going to happen. I can tell you that right now. This is going to happen.
Thank you so much to White Oak Dental for making this podcast possible.
And if you'd like to learn more about them, click the link below. I know they'd love to connect with you. Hello, and welcome to the Crosswalk Experience. I'm Shaston Rains. This is Justin Wampler, and we are here today with Brooks Priest. We're super excited to get to talk to you. You have been a part of Crosswalk Chattanooga before it was even Crosswalk Chattanooga.
Correct.
So take us back. Talk to us about how this whole thing came about.
Well, we really started out of we had a worship team. It was a core group together that had been very involved for several years at another local church here in Chattanooga. And there were moments over those years where we kind of sensed that God was calling us to do something more, but it was never clear what that was. And we would get restless and lean into it. And then we would sense that God was just saying, just wait, until he didn't. And that's how we ended up starting this.
So tell us a little bit about how that all unfolded.
Well, I mean, there was a lot of things that were kind of coincidental that initially started it. First of all, some things were changing at the other church we were involved in that kind of created a little bit of shuffling of positions. And Rick Anderson, who was one of our co-founders of Crosswalk Chattanooga, ended up kind of stepping down from his role there. And he was kind of going through a season, and then I was as well. And it ended up with he and I both in Redlands at the same time. Jacqueline and I were out there visiting some friends who just had a baby, and Rick was out there for work. And we just both were like, hey, let's go to Crosswalk. And so we went. And, I had known Tim for a long time. Tim was our pastor when I was a student at the university at Loma Linda. And so we did ministry together. And so we stayed in touch when he went to Redlands. And I kind of had in my head that I knew what Crosswalk would be like, because I'd been there when I was a student, but not with Tim there, but I knew Tim. So I was going to visit thinking, yeah, let's make sure we see Tim, and I know what this experience is going to be. And it was not anything that I expected it to be. It was everything that I had been looking for in a church and trying to do out here. And so Rick and I were both there, and we're like, I remember we're texting during the service, like all these different things and ideas. And we go talk with Tim afterwards. And I remember Rick saying to me, he's like, Brooks, they're doing what we're trying to do. Like, how are they doing this? And we go talk to Tim, and we're just kind of, catching up. And I remember asking him, because they were, when Tim came over there was like 75 people at Crosswalk. And by this time in 2017, they'd grown to probably about 1,000 people attending. And they were, really kind of bursting at the seams. And I was like, what's your growth plan? You guys are going to build a bigger building. And this was right when Loma Linda and the church were the university church were in the middle of their big, huge building campaign. And Tim was like, no, we're not doing that. And he said, we don't want to be about like going out and building a new space. We want to make this work here. But, he said maybe satellite campuses. And I kind of looked at him. I was like, oh, Crosswalk Chattanooga. And it was this little kind of joke.
Is that literally the first moment that was ever said between you guys? Okay.
It was
Serious. Rick
Rick and I there. And honestly, I think I said it. It might have been Rick, but I think I was the one that said.
You can take the credit.
Yeah, I'll take the credit for this. I was like, what about Crosswalk Chattanooga? And he's like, yeah, I mean, we could, and that led to texting, hey, Tim, what about this? Is that something we could do? Because Rick and I came back from that trip just like, man, we need to do this. And I remember going to lunch with Jacob Faulkner, our worship director here, and Rick and I were kind of thinking, man, Jacob's the music director at this other church that we'd all been a part of, and I don't know how Jacob's going to feel about this. And Jacob's immediate reaction was, we have to do that, because he had been feeling this as well. He'd been feeling the stirring, if you will. And so that led to, this was actually around the time that the One Project was going to be in Atlanta. And so I think we were already signed up to go, honestly, because it was close by. So we knew we were going to be there. And so we made sure to set up a time to meet with Tim during the One Project. And so Rick and I, Jacob wasn't able to be there, but Rick and I and Juan Martinez, who was kind of involved in our group at the time, trying to start something. We met with Tim for several hours and just kind of brainstormed how it would work. And that led to getting it going.
And what did that look like? So obviously you've come back from the One Project. What were those next steps?
So it was, we decided that it felt like the best way to get going was through small groups. So we just started kind of talking to people in our community. I remember, I think Jacob and I took you to lunch or met you for lunch in Collegedale. We're like, hey, because you had just started plugging in with us at worship.
Yeah.
But you had come from Crosswalk, and I remember you came out here, and it was always like, well, at Crosswalk we did this, and we're like, dang it, Justin. But because you were on fire for it, and you had seen what church could be, and so I remember we met with you, and you're like, I'm in. Like, whatever you guys are doing, this sounds amazing. I'm in. I'm all in. So there was really kind of a core group of my family, Jacob, Rick and his wife, you and Lindsay. And then it just kind of bled into our worship community. Once we knew that we had decided to do this and that God had made it clear what our path was, we met with our worship team that were all just kind of in our core community, many of whom you see regularly here at Crosswalk, and just told them what we were doing, what we felt God calling us to do. And we said, look, we want you to be where you're called. If you're called to continue here, we want you to follow God's leading. But if this seems like something that you're interested in, we'd love to talk more. And it wasn't like there was this, okay, 100% of them all were like in. No, there was several that were like, yeah, I'm in, because I feel called to this as well. But there was several that just, they had to see it for themselves. They had to feel it, experience it. Some that it was once we were fully planted as a church and meeting regularly before they finally like, yeah, okay, this is my home. So we started as small groups, I think probably like January of 2018. Just, I remember being at Jacob's house. There's a picture of you with your bleached out hair. And I sent it to Tim. He's like, what is Justin?
What's going on?
But we were at Jacob's house watching one of the sermons, and then I think we just had some study. We just got together, and I think it was the Lovewell series that Tim had done. That was kind of, it was a great like introduction to Crosswalk, to catch the vision, catch the ethos, and a lot of other people came in pretty quickly. My brother-in-law and sister-in-law were pretty quick with it. And this kind of all led up to getting a launch date for pop-ups, and
whose idea was to start with pop-ups? Like, where did that come from?
I feel like that was Rick and Tim, probably. Rick and Tim did a lot of the logistics and of figuring out what this would look like. Rick especially spearheaded a lot of those conversations with, whether it's with the conference, local area people that we could partner with. So I feel like that was something that between Rick and Tim and then our kind of core leadership, we felt like that would be the best way to launch. And then Tim was like, yeah, I'll fly out for it, and so this was, maybe like middle of June, I think, of 2018. And Tim flew out a couple days early. We'd arranged to, have it at the Ooltewah Middle School, partnering with Two Rivers Church that rents it on Sundays. So they have a setup for church service there. We knew we needed coffee, because that's part of the ethos of Crosswalk is not just coffee, but really good coffee, like the best you're going to have. And so I'd actually already been working on that piece of it. I bought the first machine that we still use today, the Linea Mini. I'd purchased, I think, in December of 2017. I was like, all right, it was my excuse really to invest in a nice machine. But I don't even think we used it the first pop-up. We hired Plus Coffee. They came in and they were amazing. Matt Park, was that? No, yeah, Matt Park. He was awesome. Brought his whole setup in and just knocked it out. It was great. And so, yeah, so we had that first pop-up, and I remember the night before, Friday night at my house, we hosted just kind of a gathering for all the volunteers, all the team members that were part of this. You were there, of course, and you drove in that evening because you guys were kind of moving here.
I was essentially visiting at that point.
You were visiting, yeah.
I didn't know I was.
You didn't know you were moving to Chattanooga yet. But I remember Rick brought the flags in front of our house, so as people drove up, it's like, there's the Crosswalk flags, the old logo. And so we're sitting around, and there's about 50 people in our living room and kitchen. I still have a picture of it, and Tim is there, and we had a meal, and then Tim spoke a little bit, just kind of casting vision for what we were going to do. And I remember looking around, and I was like, I think Rick said to me, he's like, Brooks, this is a church. If this is all that shows up tomorrow, this is a church. And, we did not have visions of what this would turn out to be, but we knew that God was calling to this, even if it meant meeting regularly in my basement with 25 people with acoustic guitars and a video sermon. The church we were involved in before had the big stage, the lights, everything, and it was great production.
Arguably everything you'd already want.
Yeah.
In terms of that.
In terms of a worship experience.
Yeah.
But God had just made it so clear to us what he wanted us to do. And so we went with it. And the interesting thing was, it became this, it was the new thing that we're excited about, right? And so anybody that I'm talking around socially, we'd start talking about it. Either they'd heard about it or I would just bring it up or whatever. And it wasn't like we had this plan of like, all right, we got to start talking to people. No, it would just come up organically. But what I found was so many people were like, that is needed here. Chattanooga has 30 plus Adventist churches, but there's still a group of people that weren't finding what they were looking for. So many people that were going to one of the big churches and dropping their kids off for Sabbath school, and then the parents would go to Starbucks and wait, and then they go pick them up. They weren't plugging in. And many of those people are here now. That kind of led to our vision for what kids programming would be, that you could drop your kids off while the service is going on, pick them up, and you're done. And so many little things like that played into the involvement of where we are.
How, in those early days, how did your volunteer leadership team come together?
All hands on deck. We had a launch team, and I remember Rick put that together of just different people, and we had a group text, and it was just like anyone that was involved, anyone that wanted to be involved. So if you cared about this and we knew what your skill sets were, that's what you would end up doing. And even with my wife being the original kids director, she loves to tell this story, but she was very hesitant to take that on because she has a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and just like she felt overwhelmed, but she cared about it as much or more than anybody because it was her kids. And it was one of those things in the room, and Rick kind of knew that she was hesitant, but he said, hey, Jacqueline, if somebody, I know you're not the director, but if somebody had questions about kids, like, could we send them to you to answer the questions? And she's like, yeah, I guess, and then fast forward, she's the kids director.
That's how Rick does it.
That's how he does it. He's got his ways of twisting your arm. So yeah, with the volunteers, I would say that we really focused a lot on pouring into people and spending time together. But I mean, when you're starting a church out of small groups and families, there's a lot of, people carrying many hats. Rick was our original creative director. He was also our church administrator. He was also I was the board chair from the beginning. But Rick kind of was our de facto pastoral figure.
Rick is a launcher. He's a starter.
He's a starter.
And he's so good at it. And he kept things organized.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting, even when we launched with that group. I don't think back then Apple had it where you can label what the group is. But eventually
the group chat, yeah.
Eventually we shifted out of that. That was just a launch team.
Yep.
But everybody still had a different kind of buy-in.
No, you could name it, because I remember.
Could you?
All of a sudden, the week before we started weekly services, the group chat changed the name to Launch Team. So I texted Rick. I was like, "Why'd you change the name?" He's like, "Because not everyone in that's on leadership team. We have to organize this. We have to set this up right." And so that led to us, because we had some college students in there that were doing different jobs, and some of our social media people. And so we essentially formed our leadership team out of this group that basically, if you were leading a specific area of ministry, you're on leadership team.
So we fast forwarded a little bit.
Yeah.
How long did you guys land in pop-up
So we
status?
spent the summer doing pop-ups. We did our goal was to do monthly pop-ups with the hope of launching weekly in October, November, somewhere in that range. So we basically gave ourselves about 4 or 5 months to secure a venue. We did a couple pop-ups at the Udwa Elementary School, and just felt like, man, Two Rivers Church was amazing at hosting us there. But I don't think that the school was necessarily even going to agree to letting us do it regularly. And it was a lot of work there, that I think we could have made work, but it would have created a bit of problems, I think.
It's a gymnasium.
It's a gymnasium, and then
tearing down the entire.
And then suddenly you've got 2 churches sharing it, and I think
it was.
Pop-up
3
that we went to Tyner, and I think that's because of you, right?
Your connection, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a little connection there, being a worship leader there for them on Sundays. And they had a big room that they were willing to rent out, and that's kind of where
we had to buy a bunch of stuff for it.
Yeah.
But it was cheap rent, and so we had been able to fundraise pretty quickly. Several families just started giving, and that was one thing early on. I remember, I think in December of 17, Redlands set up a fund in their local giving where we could start giving to that was for, I forget what they called it, but eventually it was just Chattanooga, and everyone's like, what's Chattanooga? What's going on there?
Yeah.
But then even Redlands people started giving to that because they were excited about this first satellite campus. So yeah, with the pop-ups, I think August. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was also going to say, let's talk a little bit about that, the support that you got from Redlands.
Oh, yeah.
You guys tell us a little bit about
so
how
that was a really cool season in the development.
Because there's no other
Crosswalk.
Campus
So
global yet
I
that did
remember
exist.
going back out there, and Tim had me come lead worship with the team there. He asked me to, and introduced me as one of the leaders for Crosswalk Chattanooga, and everyone was just so excited about that. There was just this, because Redlands was also kind of in their growth phase as well, where they're just so excited about what's happening and wanting to share this, right? And so they were so pumped for Chattanooga. And so yeah, Redlands people locally started giving to that as well.
so cool.
And I remember our first pop-ups, several at their board chair, Rick Rawson came out. I think a couple of their staff came out as well, just to support and just to kind of see what's going on and to help out. It was either our first pop-up. No, I think that was actually our launch weekend that some of them came out. But anyways, so yeah, we did. Our goal also was to try to get either Tim or Sam Lenore came out for a pop-up. So I remember our first pop-up when we got to Tyner, that room probably allowed about 250 people. We had about 300 standing room only, and we're like, oh, we already outgrew the space. Uh-oh. But we were able to make it work because Sam was there. We advertised that Sam was going to be there. And then I think he came out for maybe a couple pop-ups, actually.
Yeah, and just to say, I think it's worth stating that we launched to be kind of a satellite campus.
Yeah.
Right? We were saying, hey, let's put the preacher, which was Tim Gillespie, on a screen. We knew with pop-ups and some of those, if we could get Tim out there and Sam to get a little energy going.
Yeah.
Well, and we felt like Tim was presenting a message in Adventism that nobody else was. And we felt like that would strike a chord here. And it did. And, you know, when you're a satellite campus and most of your sermons are on video, that's hard for some people. So if you were attending regularly, it's because you're like, yeah, I want to hear this message. I don't care that he's not here in person. I want to hear this message because it's important to me and it's important for others to hear it as well. And so, in many ways, planning that type of service was fairly easy because it's predictable. You know how long it's going to be. There's not as many variables. It's also hard. What if the projector doesn't work? What if we can't download the sermon, you know? But Tim was really gracious and helpful to us because for the first few months, he recorded Chattanooga specific sermons. He cared so much about this. And again, there's this misconception that either we or Redlands or Tim had this whole game plan of how we're just going to make this movement explode. And it could not be further from the truth. This was completely spirit-led, organic. We didn't have any idea what we were doing. In fact, in many ways, if we'd been more strategic, we probably would have been smoother in some ways, but that's just not how it works. And so, you know, Tim's like, I don't know how this is going to go. I need to record some sermons for them just so they can kind of catch on to this, you know? And so for the first several months, it was, hey, Chattanooga, you know, and he'd come on the screen. Then as we started getting more campuses, that changed. But you know, he found, once we transitioned into him being able to record the same sermons that he was preaching, he actually found himself appreciating the recording because he felt like it made him better in the room come Saturday because he kind of had that time to lean into it. So, but yeah, I mean, if being a satellite campus, like you said, Justin, that was the point. We were Redlands in Chattanooga, essentially. We were Crosswalk Chattanooga. And you know, we were able to make it work in that space at Tyner. We would have in-person speaking, maybe quarterly, probably. Tim would, those early days, Tim came out 3 or 4 times a year. Those were always big weekends, but we wouldn't announce when he was coming. We did early on in our pop-up phase. But we stopped telling people because we didn't want people to only come. I remember getting questions, hey, when's Tim going to be out here again? I don't know. Come anyways. Oh, but I've got a friend I want to bring him.
I think a piece that probably people don't always realize because you come now and you see the numbers that we have. That was never the focus.
No.
The focus was always, how do we build a congregation of community? People that this is the space that they're excited to be a part of. And so I want to circle back before we move on. I want to circle back to the beginning a little bit more because you said when you went out to Redlands, it was like, this is it. Can you articulate what was that pull on your heart that you were like, this is the church experience that doesn't exist?
Well, it does exist. It had never existed in Adventism. So I remember I would go, whether I'd visit Passion City Church in Atlanta, you know, you'd go to, I remember when I was in college in Texas going to Fellowship Church. You know, you go to these churches and it felt like there was this energy when you walked in the doors where people were excited to be there, which you just didn't experience that in the churches I grew up in. And I remember going to Redlands. I remember walking through the doors. I'm like, where are all these people coming from? There's people pouring out from the first service, people pouring in for the second service. I'm like, wow, these people they're here early. Why are they here early? Oh, it's because the cafe's open. The coffee bar's open. Well, that coffee bar is packed. You know, it was everything that, you know, all these little things that we do for experience, they matter, you know? And so I couldn't articulate in that moment what it was, but it was everything working together that gave me this feeling of they're doing what we've tried to do. I have this feeling in an Adventist church. This is amazing, you know? And getting into the worship service where, I mean, the auditorium's full when the first song starts. You know, like, what is that? You know, and the music was very well done. You know, it was, you know, as a worship leader, I appreciate something that is, you know, some people call it professional. I call it distraction-free worship, you know, well mixed, well done, so that I can just get caught up in the worship experience. Everyone else can. And it was really simple service, worship, a little greeting, and then Pastor Tim came out, delivered the message, one more song at the end. It was an hour, give or take. And so I think it was more so there wasn't this one magic ingredient that made it, that it was all the things together. And this is the Experience podcast. We talk about guest experience. We talk about all these things. We care so much about when you pull into this parking lot, what do you feel? It starts with the signs at the intersection, and then the signs on the outside when you walk in. It's this feeling of expectation. All these little things matter. And so back in 2017, they were doing a version of all that.
Yeah.
Redlands has evolved. We've evolved. We have to keep changing and evolving. But those core things were there back then and are still there today.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to me when you start a church, and even we started a little differently because we said, man, what Crosswalk and Redlands is doing, we want to be kind of a part of that.
Yep.
But we also still got to launch just sort of like in a way of we get to pick what we're going to do. We're not going to pass an offering plate.
Yep.
We're like, that's a distraction. And if we don't need that.
Well, and that was one thing. Redlands didn't take an offering. We're like, what?
Yeah. And they had to go through the pain of making that choice after they've existed.
They made that change. Yep.
And now we've been growing up a little bit. Anytime you make a change, it's harder now. We don't have as many sacred cows probably as other churches, but we've still existed a while now. But in the beginning, you get to say, we're not going to do that. Why would it? We're just not.
Well, and that's the beauty of starting from scratch.
Yeah.
It's really hard to come into an existing church and change things because one group might feel strongly about it, but then the other group, or maybe the pastor or somebody, you're not all united in it. And I know Tim was able to make those changes at Redlands because there were 75 people when he started.
Yeah.
They were
dying.
open to it. So it wasn't like he came into a smooth running 600 member church that grew to 2,000 and
he still had to go through it.
He had to go through those changes.
Yeah.
But it was almost like a relaunch for them. And so all of us that were involved as core leadership, by the time we were really launching pop-ups, you were here. I think by our third pop-up was when you kind of took over coffee. Not kind of completely.
You
took
started
over coffee.
with kids. Is that what you've said?
That's a different story.
Yeah,
we can get to that. We can get to that.
Pop-up number one.
Yeah, Shaston was actually our original kids director. No one knows this for one weekend. But all of us had been involved in leadership at different churches.
That's to be fair. Let's not undervalue that.
No,
there was some sort of, I would say, spirit-led miracle that kind of happened.
Yep.
In that group that you talked about that just kind of got invited and ended up in the circle of leadership. Everyone in that circle had either planted a church, 1, 2, sometimes this was their third plant.
Yep.
And that wasn't strategic.
No.
That was just what happened. And the other piece that I would say, going back to your point around some of the choices that we made, one of the things that I remember being a main discussion of our True North was we wanted to be a place that everyone could feel welcome, particularly those that didn't feel comfortable in a more traditional church environment.
Yep.
And a lot of our decisions early on, like not passing the offering plate, not having a bulletin, those kind of things, were centered around creating this distraction-free environment where people could find connection and find Jesus.
Absolutely.
Without some of those traditional tenets that had maybe been connected to wounding points in their life.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is something that I think is still a main true north of our culture now.
Absolutely.
But that informed a lot of those early decisions.
Yeah, now it just becomes more challenging to navigate it. You're so big and you gotta
and to explain it.
Yeah.
It was like second nature back then. We all got it.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting point because Brooks, you've been our board chair since the beginning.
Yes.
You've walked us through a lot of things. What have been some of the most challenging moments for you?
Well, I would say the first year and a half, 2 years were all just building excitement, momentum, leaning into that core value of Crosswalk. Where the challenges early on were maybe just having conversations with people that had questions, but I was always so excited to have those conversations. And thankfully they were overwhelmingly positive. You get the occasional one that's like, "Are you guys even Adventist?" You know, I'm like, "Yes, absolutely." Call the conference, ask them. Ed Wright, the president at the time, sanctioned this,
Yeah.
gave us his blessing to be a mission group. And you navigate those types of questions, but I would say the first real challenge arose when COVID hit, figuring out, well, what we were going to do. Now, some of those decisions were made initially by local authorities in the conference and
By
everything
that
like that.
point, we were at Abba's house.
Yeah. No,
No,
not yet.
we were
No,
not.
we're still at
We
time.
Oh, we left.
Yeah.
You're right. You're
Yeah.
right.
So we
You're
actually
right.
never had to make a decision, should
You're
we
right.
meet or not, because the Methodist Church made that decision
You're
for
right.
us. They completely shut down their building. We had no access to it. In fact, it was hard to even get
Our
in there and get our
stuff, yeah.
stuff
Yeah.
for a while. So it was a challenge to maintain engagement. But
Yeah.
what we learned during that time is how much people crave and value community, because we had it and you take it away, then they want it even more. And so we kind of relaunched again. I always say that we've started over at Crosswalk Chattanooga 3 times.
Yeah.
The first time was the launch. Second time was during COVID. And so figuring out another venue, figuring out how to do in-person services, how to do pop-ups, how to maintain engagement. I think we still tried to have some outreach opportunities, things like that. We finally had our first pop-up in August of 2020 out an outdoor venue. The next month we got an Abba's house. We tried another venue at one of the big Baptist church,
Woodland Hills.
Woodland,
Isn't that
Woodland Park,
Woodland.
something. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's down the road from Tyner.
Our switcher guy knows.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, he knows. And one service there. I think we would have loved to meet there, but it didn't work out with the church there. I think they just, I don't know. It just wasn't meant to be.
Yeah.
God clearly led us to Abba's house, which was amazing. So when we did monthly pop-ups there, so that was a challenge getting through that season. And then got us to June of 2021 when we launched meeting weekly again. By that time, most churches had been back regularly. I think by end of 2020, most churches were like, yeah, we're doing this. Just try to figure it out. We made the decision to follow local requests and guidelines. But that was a challenge as the board chair because, especially as we got back into weekly services, there was still a lot of discomfort around the pandemic that was still very much going, and a lot of opinions, and it was tough to navigate that, to hear different perspectives, help them feel heard and loved, and also try to make decisions that still were for the best of the church. I don't think we were perfect in all of it. I don't think we made all the exact correct decisions. We tried to do the best we could, and God took care of us through it. Our community restarted essentially, and it was really a season of growth for us, because at that point, if you were driving to Hickson across the bridge, you really wanted to be at Crosswalk. So that was a challenge.
Yeah, it'd take you 45 minutes to get home. Sometimes.
Yeah. Depending.
Yeah, and so that was tough. And then probably the biggest challenge was when we were moving to this space, and just basically from Justin's harebrained idea that we should
yes,
rent from Venue Church.
Let's talk about that, because that is another big significant moment here at Crosswalk. So we'd come out of the pandemic, we'd spent a year over in Hickson and Abba's house, but the majority of our community were on this side, more Ooltewah, Collegedale, Chattanooga side of things.
Yeah.
And yes, we all as a leadership team, I remember that leadership team meeting, you particularly pointed it out, where we just felt this restlessness that we were supposed to find something else, which led us here.
Well, we'd kind of always said, even though Abba's house logistically, for the most part, worked well, we never felt like that's where God wanted us to be long term. I remember we used to always say, I don't think we're going to be here that long.
Well, we wanted to upgrade some things, but we were just like waiting, not getting anywhere.
Oh yeah, we were going to invest in the lobby over there.
There's a ton of stuff we were going to do.
Yeah.
And God just kept shutting that door, which was interesting, because we were willing to step in, make this our long-term home. And that door just kept closing, which then led us to the door being open slightly for renting here at what at the time was Venue Church.
And this was a venue, a location that we'd kind of always had our eye on. I think we even reached out at some point about renting from them earlier on in our process, but never heard anything. And then,
Maybe really early on before
yeah,
they
but
kind of went through their stuff.
I think, you had heard or somebody had heard through the grapevine that they, were open to renters. And so that,
So here's the quick version of that,
Yeah.
which I was driving around looking for some places, and I saw some of the other businesses that said for rent.
mm,
Wasn't even thinking that big yet.
yeah,
And I called the sign on it and talked to the agent, and the agent said, no, 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 none of those would even fit for you. But hey, you should get a hold of Venue Church because they're going through some stuff right now.
yeah,
So then I went to church there Sunday
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
and met Tavner Smith and had a good conversation with him.
Yeah.
And then some things started moving with renting.
yeah,
And we launched renting here officially. That was summer of 2022.
July of 22. Yeah.
That's what I
I
remember.
think it was like July 20th. It was like the 3rd or 4th weekend in July that
Okay.
we had our first.
And
Sabbath
for
meeting.
how long that took, though, I showed up at Venue Church for Valentine's Day. That's how long we were in a conversation that wasn't
Yeah.
even, was just
Yeah.
slowly going.
I remember Tavener came to our Easter service
Yeah.
at Abba's house. By that time, we'd met and
Yeah.
toured the space and started thinking about how it could work. And I think we might have still we were still fulfilling a lease at Abba's house.
Yeah.
It just wasn't, summertime was kind of always the goal there. But, we'd been so nomadic in our locations that, kind of knowing, Venue was having some financial struggles at the time. And so we, by God's wisdom, asked for first right of refusal on potentially purchasing the building with literally no ability to do so.
Yeah.
We didn't have money in the bank. We weren't a 10, 15-year established church. I don't know. You never know.
Yeah.
That's kind of how we've always worked, and so, but we wanted to have that opportunity because we don't know what God could
And we
work
knew
out
they
for
were
us.
going through stuff.
Knew they were
you're
going
just
through
in the
stuff,
back of
so
your head.
we wanted the opportunity, if possible, for somebody in our community, whether it's the conference on our behalf or, whatever, to be able to purchase the building if it came available.
And we had signed a lease, and I remember at the time we were ready to invest. I know I'd been working on plans
had
to
plans.
get
Yeah, we had a
our
contractor
coffee
in
bar
here.
going.
Yep.
And we knew again that eventually we might have the opportunity to purchase, but that we didn't think that was going to be in the near future. And then walk us through that conversation because
Yeah.
Justin,
So-
did you get the phone call?
Well, so let me
Justin,
just say,
yeah.
we signed a longer term lease than we'd ever signed.
5 years.
Yeah. Because we said, okay, we're willing to stay here, and we
Yeah.
had some different kind of workarounds because we were going to be sharing a facility with somebody else who owned it. So we said, well, if we're going to sign this, we want to be able to design some things. We want to put in a little cafe.
We got
I
permission.
say little cafe, like
It was gonna be
airport
small.
style.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Small kitchen.
Yeah. And so we were there
Yeah.
a month,
No, 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Yep.
2 weeks.
We had 2 services here.
Yeah.
And it was, I think, the Sunday or the Saturday of our second service. And John Hughes, I think, called you or me. I think he called you because I think you're the one that called me and said, hey, things are happening. And that's when it all, we found out that the church Venue was having to sell the building because of the financial issues. And so that kind of kicked things into gear.
So let's talk about that story.
Sure. It's one of my favorite stories.
It is a wild ride for
Mhm.
sure. So we get the call that it's going to be going up for sale.
Yep.
Talk to us about what happened there because, like you mentioned, we were not in a position to just.
Yeah, so it's one of those things where you just start kicking in the tires. So I think probably one of my first conversations was with Kurt Allen. Thankfully, by this point, so a couple things to clarify. While Rick Anderson was here, he was always the communication with the conference. So he, communicated with Ed, right? And then when Gary Rustad became the president after Ed retired, Rick, maintained those relationships. Well, when Rick left and moved to Portland, I assumed that role. And so I reached out to Gary. He and I got dinner together just to connect and just kind of get to know each other, and I anything I could do to help familiarize him with Crosswalk and what we were doing and whatnot, um, would be helpful. Um, I think I had at some point met Kurt Allen. Oh, yeah, we'd talked with Kurt a fair bit, and AdCom had come to Abba's house when we got our company status. So we'd at that point we were building relations with Victor Maddox and those guys, building relationships with them for the church, and so you start kicking the tires. Like I called Kurt. I was like, "Hey, this is what's happening. We do have first right of refusal. Is there any chance that I know that we are not even an official church, but would the conference even consider purchasing this building to own for whatever, and we can rent it from the conference, or if you want to purchase it on our behalf, and we figure out the the financials of it." And Kurt was amazing because what God did through Kurt was he allowed just a glimmer of hope in there. The door refused to be shut because Kurt could have so easily said, "Oh, Brooks,
Yeah.
we will do everything we can to help you guys find a space." But you guys are a baby church. Like we have, unfortunately, for a conference to run efficiently, we have metrics in place. We have policies in place because everyone wants church. Everyone needs building. And unfortunately, you guys just don't meet that, but we'll do everything we can to help you find a space. He could have said that. And I would have said, okay, that makes sense.
And let's give a
Where do we go?
tiny bit of context on where Crosswalk was at that point. We were a community of about 600 people coming every week.
At the most.
And we did
Yeah.
not have a pastor. We were
Yep.
completely lay-led.
Yep.
We were still considered a
Company.
company,
Yeah.
so we could take membership.
Yeah.
But that was kind of the lay of the land. So
Yeah.
we're on the
We had
early side.
We had 100 members that were charter members.
Yes.
And we had an average weekly attendance of probably about 400 people, 400 to 500. Easter weekend, 650, I think, something like that. All with video sermons, you know. And so, yeah, we were a big baby church, a big church for being so new, but we just didn't have the infrastructure there, and so Kurt could have shut it down, and he didn't. He said, "Well, we've bought buildings at auction before at the courthouse. If this is going into bankruptcy, if the banks are foreclosing on it, it's gonna go to the courthouse." And he said, "What we need to do is we need to get Gary in the building. Russ Dad
is the president.
He said, and I need to be there. And I know you guys, Dave has been helping you guys. Ferguson has been helping you out. We should get Dave in the room too." I was like, "Great. Sounds good. Let's set it up." I think within a week, they were all up here for executive committee or something like that. And so we were able to get Gary, Kurt, Dave. We all met here. We toured the space with them. And with John Hughes, our member, but also our realtor. And again, talk about someone who God put in our community, because John used to work for the development company that owns this whole space. He knows the ins and outs of this space. He has relationships with people. And this is a guy who's representing us for free, that he gave that because this was his community, So, we talk about how God put the right leadership people in place. He just kept doing this. John was a total godsend, still very much part of our community. And so we went back to Dave, said, "Hey, why don't we go to University Church?"
Got some pizza.
Yeah, he got some pizza and met in one of the conference rooms and with whiteboards. And I think Kurt stood up and just started like, "All right, if you guys could do this." And I missed one detail. The other thing that Kurt told me that we needed to do was have a church business meeting.
Yeah.
He said, because before Gary's in the room, he's going to want to know, what does the church think?
Yeah.
And he said, you guys have like 100 members. So he's like, if you can get like 30 people there, that'd be a quorum, but you need to have a quorum. You need to take records, but you need to have an emergency business meeting. We'd never done that before. We never had to.
Yeah.
And
at this point, we didn't even know what the asking price was going to be.
Didn't know. We had ideas, we had thoughts, but we didn't know.
Yeah.
And so keep in mind, our community has been with us, most of them through Tyner, through Abba's house, and we're so pumped to be here.
Yes.
And the concept of losing our space yet again was devastating. And God used that to energize people. And so I remember we sent out, I think Alyssa was our communications director at the time, I think, and she typed up something and we got it sent out and got this email sent out. I think that was from me probably, and sent it out and told leadership team, text as many people as you can. We need like 30 people to show up. We met in the overflow room, and it was packed.
Yeah.
It was 100 people there.
People
that showed
standing.
up.
Yeah, you couldn't.
And so basically what Kurt wanted us to do was find out if the church supports pursuing this and get people to commit if they support it and take a vote to pursue it. And so we did, and it was overwhelming. And then someone said, "Can we start making pledges now?" I was like, "Sure." By 7:00 that evening, I think we had about $500,000 pledged, something like that. It was ridiculous what was happening. And so that was helpful to be able through our conversations with the conference. And then, so we had that meeting with Gary and everybody, and they kind of had a loose roadmap of how maybe it could work, but there was so much unknown at the time because venue was foreclosed on. They weren't sure if they were going to file bankruptcy.
Yeah.
Us with first right of refusal, Kurt was very clear. It's like, well, the conference would never buy it without an offer. Let the price be dictated by what the offers are. We're not going to be the first offer. So there's just a lot of waiting. Meanwhile, we're still having weekly services, paying rent, and venue still meeting, and so there was several weeks of kind of unknown and there was
I think an interesting piece that I would love for you to talk
Sure.
about was the experience, because you just described how we weren't going to make an offer.
Yeah.
So that meant that other communities or other businesses in
Yep.
the area could make an offer.
Yeah.
Talk to us about what happened, because there were 2 other churches.
Yes.
That was a beautiful story.
This was really interesting. So we didn't feel equipped on paper that we should be buying this church. It didn't make sense.
Yeah.
It did not make sense. And so part of us were kind of looking for another church that we could partner with to come in. And one of those was Rock Point Church. And we had some connections there still because of just, different ministries in the past. And Seth Medley, our front of house director, used to work there. That's how we built a relationship with Rock Point originally. So we knew that they were interested as well. I connected with the pastor, who is a phenomenal guy, amazing guy. And we just connected. We had lunch and he's like, "Brooks, I'm praying for Crosswalk." I was like, "Awesome. I'm praying for Rock Point," and on paper, it would have made so much sense for Rock Point because they are also renting from an Adventist church.
Yeah.
They were kind of feeling like they needed their own space, and so they were very interested in pursuing this. And on paper, that would have made a ton of sense for us because in terms of mission and vision, very, very similar. We could have shared with them and rented from them very easily, I think. And I think it would have been great. And so they kind of came into the picture trying to buy the space. There was another local church, a Pentecostal church, that was also very interested in the space. And so these were the 2 that were kind of, trying to rally their communities to see if God was leading them to pursue it. And, it was really interesting because just seeing how God was moving through this, I remember getting off the phone and thinking, all right, Rock Point's going to buy it, because they got to a point where the other church, who was kind of in the lead, if you will, in terms of getting closer, because there was a deadline for when venue would have to file bankruptcy if they couldn't get under contract with the banks. And last minute, the financing for the Pentecostal church fell through it because it was such a constrained time frame.
Yeah.
And so something didn't work. And so I remember calling Rock Point pastor. I was like, "Looks like it's going to be yours if you guys want it." And he's like, "Oh, okay." And the deadline came and went. And God didn't make it clear to them that this is what they were supposed to do. And so they essentially pulled out of it. But through all of that, I remember this pastor would periodically reach out to us and reach out to me, and "Oh, I'm just praying for you guys, praying for Crosswalk." And it was really cool to experience that because this is another area church, not an Adventist church, that's rooting for us, that found value in what we were doing. Um, and feeling his support, I think was huge for us, and seeing how God was moving.
And even both churches, I remember at the time, both churches that were interested did not want to bid up the price on each other,
They
and
didn't.
both of them were
Yeah.
concerned, "Hey, where's
What's
Crosswalk?"
Crosswalk? They were
Because
very
they
concerned.
did
Yeah.
not want us to be
Yeah.
homeless. They always cared about
And it wasn't that they needed the rent money from us. It
Yeah.
was they knew our story, and they did care about how it would be for us.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this would have been November.
Well, this is late August when all this was going on, and then they
Yes.
filed bankruptcy, and then that put us into about 8 weeks of just waiting,
But
seeing what's
Yeah.
gonna happen.
Let's fast forward to that
Yeah.
call that we got right before anniversary weekend 2023.
2022.
Sorry,
Yeah.
2022.
Yeah. Yeah.
My bad. 2022.
Yeah.
Talk to us about that call that happened right then, because that is what kicked off
Yeah,
the next
so
event.
I think it was Justin calling me, or it was John.
Oh,
Might
there's a
have been
lot of
John.
calling.
Yeah,
at
there's a
that
lot of phone
time.
calls. But it was basically, we got the call that an offer. So once Venue filed bankruptcy, then that gave the other church that really wanted it time to get their financing in order. And so this other church, they were able to get it in order, and they made an official offer. And we learned of that offer the Friday of anniversary weekend. Tim was in town already, so we learned about this. And I remember calling him or talking to him at the church that night, and I was like, "Well, here it is." He's like, "All right." He said, "Well, we're gonna make this. We're not gonna make this a request. We're gonna ask. We're gonna make this a prayer." And I remember him getting up in front of our congregation, and he had a anniversary sermon prepared that he did most of, but he spent a good portion talking about what was in front of us. And he said, "We're not going to ask for money today. We're asking for you to pray over this. If this is something that you think God is calling us to do, move within this community, but we want you to pray over that."
And what was the ask? Because I remember the number.
Oh, the price. Yeah, it was
just the context.
3
please give
point
details.
3.3 million, something like that, And so, yeah, so the offer was there. And I remember first thing Monday, I called Kurt, let him know, and I called Gary, and because Kurt was like, "Well, maybe if you could get this," and then he's like, "But it's gonna be up to Gary," because we were breaking policy either way, which the conference will do that when there's
By breaking policy, you mean breaking their formula.
breaking their formula, and they'll do that when there's certain circumstances that dictate it. But usually the local church has a part to play in it. So they've got skin in it, and so there's usually a number that they have to come up with. And I remember talking to Gary, and I was like, "All right, so this is the asking price. We've got close to $1 million pledged." He's like, "Well, how much is cash in hand?" I was like, "I don't know." He said, "Well, you need cash in hand." I was like, "Can we do it at $1 million?" No. He said, "It's just not going to work." He said, "You need to have $2 million. All right. Okay. Well, if we have cash in hand by closing," I said, "Nope." I said, because we had 15 days to match the offer is what it was.
Yes.
From that Friday. That's when it
Yeah.
went into play there. And I was like, "Well, Gary, but we can't, my request to him was, can the conference just go ahead, and we've got $1 million pledged. Can the conference match the offer? And then we've got the time to round up the money and get it." He's like, "Has to be cash in hand in 15 days. And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because we invest so much money in due diligence."
Yeah.
He's like, "We're talking $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 we're going to spend on attorneys, due diligence fees, everything like that. We have to have the money in hand." I was like, all right, felt discouraged. Remember calling Don Duff. He's like, "Really? That's crazy." He calls Gary, and Gary tells him the same thing. And he's like, "All right, well, it just got a little bit harder, but let's go, But it's really interesting though, because I remember the day before that I'd run into somebody in the community that's a real estate developer, an investor. And I just kind of shared what the opportunity was with him. And he was like, "Wow." He's like, seems like a really good opportunity. That would be great. He's like, I almost want to tell you to just say yes and we'll figure it out. Granted, this would have been like a private investor backing us a bit, but that would have been a tough route to go that way. But, there were other real estate investors that were potentially interested in just owning the building that we could have rented from. But in terms of us, it being ours and owning it, it would go through the conference. And so Gary was very clear. And though it was frustrating for me at the time that I was like, oh man, they won't work with us. Come on. It was frustrating.
And daunting.
2
million in hand, 15 days.
15 days, cash in hand,
right
from a community of 400 people.
Yep. And we find this out right at anniversary day.
And we find out at day 3 of the 15 days that this is what it is, And so we're like, all right, well, we need to find out if this other church, if we need to meet them. We need to meet with them and see, because we're still kind of like, should we be pursuing this?
Yep.
We still didn't know, because again, really high bar to hit.
Yeah.
Is this responsible? Is this really what God wants from us?
Can we even do it?
And so we go and meet with these wonderful people at their current facility.
That was you two, right?
Us two and John Hughes.
Yeah.
And we met with them. They're fantastic people. So kind to us. But they had very different visions for the building, very different visions for how they would operate, very different visions for how they would want to run church. From whether it was construction changes to wanting to open up a full-time daycare here, like all sorts of things that would have made it very challenging for us to share the space, things that made perfect sense for them and their community. But we walked out of that meeting, and I remember Justin and I looked at each other and like, we won't last 6 months.
Yeah.
If we don't buy this building. And because our board at that point weren't united in that this is what God was calling us to do. It was probably 50-50, I would say.
Yeah, because we could still, in theory, rent.
So many people on the board and the community are like, well, our lease is good still. And it was. Like, we can still rent. Like, we just need to rent, Once we learned what was going to be, what the other church's plans were for the space, and that it really didn't match up with our vision, we realized that there was only one option for us. And so that's when the board really leaned in. And I remember we had so many Zoom meetings during that time. But I remember getting on a Zoom call that night and just telling everyone was like, oh. And we just started picking up the phone, started calling people. I remember Shaston came over. We called 2 of our best friends from California, $10,000 just like that. We're like,
yeah,
well, that was easy. Who else can we call? Called somebody else, procured another $100,000. Suddenly all this, we're calling all the people that have made pledges. Hey, I know you pledged 20 grand or 10 grand or 15 or 5 grand. How much of that is good right now?
Yeah.
Amazingly, almost all of it. It was incredible. There was some that weren't able to. That's totally understandable. But it was amazing to me how quickly, to where by 1 weekend, we were at $1 million cash in hand.
Yeah.
By that point, we could feel the momentum. And we knew that some other help was potentially coming in as well.
Were you updating Gary at this time?
Yeah.
Was he feeling that?
I was updating him regularly. I was sending, I should go back in my text feed with him, but I was updating him regularly. And but I think the pinnacle of this whole thing was that midweek, that middle point, the Saturday following, where we hadn't raised it yet, but we used our sermon time essentially to. It's the only time I've ever preached at Crosswalk. I didn't preach, but I spent 15 minutes up front talking about where we were, what this meant, and what we felt God calling us to do. And I remember walking off, and somebody came up to me. She's like, Brooks, you realize that this is happening? I'm like, no, I don't know. And she looked at this, Joyce Newmeyer. She looked at me and she said, Brooks, this is going to happen. I can tell you that right now. This is going to happen. Meanwhile, I know Dave is texting Gary and because I've been keeping Dave updated, who was not our pastor yet, but just letting him know what's going on. And he's texting Gary like, I think they might do it. I think this might happen. Just be ready for that phone call.
Yeah.
And by the grace of God and his amazing movement, by Tuesday, following that Saturday, we had procured the $2 million cash in hand. And there was a conference call that we were on with Don Duff. Don, I can't say enough about Don. Don led the charge, not because this was his church, because it was his kids' church, and his grandkids' church. He didn't have grandkids. He did. He had Landry. This was his kids' church. That's why. And Don attends regularly, but this is his kids' church.
Yeah.
And he leaned in for 2 weeks, went on a 2-week bender, he said, and he called everybody he knows. And Don has been in this community for a long time, and this would not have happened without God using Don to make this happen. And I remember him on that call with conference officials saying, "Yep." And as of last night, I think this was a Wednesday morning call, but as of Tuesday night, we've procured the $2 million. And I remember at first it was like crickets, and it was like, "Oh, wow, that's amazing." And on reflection in conversations with Gary afterwards, he said, "Brooks, I knew that we had to see the miracle to be able to break the policy." He said, "Because I have to answer to other people in this whole entire conference. And I knew, what's the number that you just can't explain?" And he said, because he said, even at 2 million, you're still outside of policy.
Yeah.
You're still not in it, because we weren't. And he said, we needed to see the miracle, and look at God.
And I think there's some interesting pieces about that fundraising, even in the fact that we had about 200 unique.
That was incredible.
Donations.
We had anywhere from college students. There was a college student that gave $1,000 of his or her, I don't remember who it was, but of their own money. It wasn't their parents' money. A lot of that happened too, though. Students calling their parents.
I think there was some data that we had that was maybe like 80% of our or something had
had participated.
Yeah.
We had
like
200 because it was 225 unique givers.
Yeah.
Well, you got to think a family's a unique giver.
Yeah.
Like you and Lindsay are the same giver.
Yeah.
You and Marcelo are the same.
Yep.
So having that many was also unheard of.
And it was phenomenal as well to feel the support from the Redlands campus.
Yep.
Tim
Yep.
was talking about
He
this,
was,
talking about on
yep.
the podcast. We got donations from all across the nation.
Yep.
I had a friend in Hawaii that was following our story and
Yep.
donated to the
Yep.
project. I remember you telling a story of someone walking into your office that week of. Do you mind sharing that? And bringing you a check.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, yes. Okay. Because there was a lot of people, but I know the exact one you're talking about. And I'm going to get emotional thinking about this. Yeah. Someone who I've been very close with for a long time and been part of Crosswalk from the beginning. And I don't, even though we're good friends, I don't know their financial situation. And he said, "Are you at your office?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "All right, I'm coming. I'm bringing a check." I was like, "Okay." He hands me a check for a number that did not make sense to me. And I was like, "What are you doing?" This is before we'd hit the number. And he said, "I pull money out of retirement and investments." I said, "Why are you doing that?" He said, and he looked at me, tears in his eyes. He said, "This is for my kids." He said, "They love this church. And I want to do this for them. And this is too important." And he leveraged, again, it was just, it was a lot. And there were so many people doing that because they felt the call. And that was, gosh, you brought that up. I hadn't thought about that in a while. When you first said that, I was like, I don't know which one she's talking about. You got me to cry.
Right. There were just so many beautiful stories.
Yeah.
And I think those of us that got to walk that journey
Yeah.
are so privileged
Yep.
because every time we walk in this building,
Oh, we feel it.
you can't
Yeah.
not have gratitude.
Yep.
And
Yep.
yes, are we in a season of needing to do improvements? We're heading towards a building campaign.
Yep.
The story's not finished.
Yeah.
But every time I step in, I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, this is exactly where God wanted us.
And it's just so cool looking back through how he was working, because I remember we hadn't even interviewed Dave as our pastor yet, but he was so invested.
Yeah.
He was calling me all the time. Dave and Carolyn gave to the building fund. I remember seeing that come through. I was like, what?
Yeah.
And he's like, I want to be part of this, and not as our pastor, but he wanted to be part of helping it happen. And, that's a whole other story. But, it was just, that was a wild ride, where all of our faith was so tested. But watching God move and come through. And, that's where, what we're stepping into now with another building campaign is very different, right? But and it's gonna happen differently because we don't have this 15-day rush. But it's like, this is nothing for God. Look what he's done before. If it matters to him, it's gonna happen.
Yeah, I'll say, Brooks, because you and I were in the thick of it for that entire time, and I appreciate all your leadership in it. I mean, just what a kind of a wild experience. I think, like you sort of even said, I don't think we really thought it was even happening until all of a sudden you realize we have raised 2 million. And I'm still, I think even a part of me was like, until they hand us the keys,
and it wasn't all roses even after that in terms of the logistics of getting there. There was still some
and then closing took, that was the due diligence, everything you go through. So we didn't get the building till March. Right, where we get the keys and this is ours. And then basically we were handed a shell of a building and that we tried to
met our needs at the time. Mostly.
But we didn't have a sound system or anything.
Didn't have a sound system.
The former church and they took what their stuff. And so, just a wild ride to go through. I'll say this to transition us a little bit. That is just a drop in the bucket, I think, of the miracles that are happening at Crosswalk, right? It's the easy and story to tell that is phenomenal, and we will tell it. But I think it's cool. I think there's a lot more miracles that are still happening.
Absolutely.
That those stories aren't always being told even.
Well, and you think about it because Dave shares these miracles all the time of people having experiences that are happening because we have this space. So that big miracle paved the way. Miracle. That obvious miracle paved the way for countless other miracles in people's lives individually. I mean, just look at the fruits of it. All the baptisms we've had, I mean, Dave always says he's baptized more people in his 2 years at Crosswalk than anywhere else. It's so incredible.
So I think probably Brooks will end up on season 2 because we just got to only a part and there's been a lot of time that's happened that we probably still have a lot more story for you to be able to share because you've been our board chair for a long time and a lot going on. One of our worship leaders, part of a lot of things. But for now, I think we are super grateful for you being here, sharing part of that perspective. It's cool because a lot of different people through this season of this podcast will share their own little perspectives of it. And yours was a very clear, not clear maybe to you, but you had direct on sights on this. And so grateful for you being here.
Thanks for having me.
But we are so grateful for everybody watching here, our podcast, the Crosswalk Experience. Like and subscribe. Stay tuned for more episodes.